Let me just begin by just talking a little bit about how we kind of segment wireless in our kind of market understanding from an ARC market research perspective, and I promise there'll only be a few slides here. But really the application is a very important segment in the market as we kind of divvy it up. And we look at it in terms of sensing, mobility, and backhaul, which is kind of more infrastructure. And sometimes you hear a lot of buzzwords about wireless sensor networks or whatever the terms are. There's a million terms. But sensing is a very distinct application and one that's very challenging. Mobility is really the key, probably the major driver in terms of adoption of wireless in both in the process industries and also in general, obviously, with the telecommunications. And backhaul is kind of the hidden part. We've had that for years in SCADA applications. Telecom, it's just a segment of telecom, but it's an important part of bringing the sensing and the applications to the network infrastructure. In terms of sensing, what we see is that really process manufacturing has gone way ahead in terms of ahead of discrete manufacturing in terms of having the applications. The reason for that is just the characteristics of the automation. That process automation is very much more, the control and monitoring is much more able to tolerate latency than many factory applications. There are a lot of factory applications that would be of interest, but they can't really tolerate the latency. And you see one example of that is the kind of pervasive sensing vision that's articulated by Emerson, but it is a vision of having many, many more sensors at a much lower cost point so that the cost to deploy is lower. And also another segment really of the market is really seeing smart devices as sensors, and that is for tracking people, tracking hazards and other kinds of applications related to safety and environmental and others. Mobility, as I said, is the really big application, and it's using a different technology. In the case of mobility, it's really a flip side. It's really the discrete industries where you see mobility widely deployed. So if you go into, I don't know if you're here for the General Motors presentation on Tuesday, but if you go into that huge facility that they showed, wireless LAN, wireless local area network, is absolutely critical for the whole operation. The virtually anything that moves around and is not wired is connected to that wireless LAN. Material handling and vehicles, both automatically guided and manually guided, are very critical for their operation. So wireless LAN is really the key infrastructure in the discrete industries and becoming extremely pervasive. In the process industries, we see a technology called land mobile radio, which is a legacy, if you will. It's a voice-only system in general, but it is still vital in terms of the operations and the kind of operations and procedures that people have for managing process automation. And finally, carrier services, the AT&Ts, and I can't mention because they're not a sponsor, but other carriers like AT&T. But the carrier services, traditionally in the process manufacturing, the process manufacturers, because they really are responsible for the environmental and health and safety of their facilities, don't essentially rely on carrier services for their operation. They've usually relied on a private network. But many, many more applications are starting to use carrier services. And finally, backhaul. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but infrastructure providers traditionally have done this for SCADA applications. In terms of the carrier networks, we talked about the IoT or the Internet of Things applications. There's certainly been many examples in some of the sessions. I've only attended one of those, unfortunately, but examples of those kind of services where people are using essentially a carrier network instead of a private network for the solution. And what I think we will see in some of the remote applications in manufacturing, especially in process manufacturing, is we're going to see hybrid networks that are part private and part carrier. And automation suppliers are starting to take the really big backhaul segments that they have and figure out how to use carrier services in a better way so that they can effectively connect people who are remote service people, their own workforce. They can engage their own workforce. One example I would talk about is another presentation I didn't happen to see yesterday in the analytics session. There was a presentation, you might want to check the slides, by a fellow from Shell who talked quite a bit about that. And the drive is to really, you almost want to extend the control network to a long distance. In reality, you don't want to extend the control network, but you really want to have, you want to remove the aspect of remoteness from assets that are offshore or assets that are in isolated locations, which is very much the case now, not just with offshore, but with the unconventional development. So they're very dispersed and remote assets. And that's enough from me. Now let's kind of turn it over to the experts.